All right, so there's two things that I don't believe in doing: ever watching BET again and discussing family business in the company of the colonizer. That said, this platform has now gotten large enough, despite myself, where one, it really don't matter. Y'all are going to wind up finding y'all way into the house anyway, and two, I can at least sort of push back on certain narratives pertaining to black identity that have percolated into mainstream consciousness, and y'all will pay attention. For instance, what we'll be discussing today: everybody's favorite pseudoscience punching bag, the ever lovable Hotep. This is the question that I've seen more times than how did Emmanuel Acho manage to smash Joy Taylor. The answer is that's what happens when shame societies lose the shame part of their society, and the answer to how that happens is capitalism. But this ain't that video. Y'all can go ask Cam Newton about his thoughts on that. So, as I've said in the past, I myself was basically raised by Hoteps, or at least Hoteps adjacent. And to this day, I still consider myself, even if not a full-blown divine mathematics practitioner, then at least somewhere in that wheelhouse. And when I do say this, the non and newly black among y'all act like I was also named in that FS1 lawsuit. I mean, I'm just saying, Joy, you really could have did better than Acho. Acho, really? Joy, really? Come on, girl. And I get it. Not gonna lie, if you read the wiki entry on Hoteps, which I mean, for most of y'all, that means furiously typing out a 12 tweet and/or skeet thread based on your initial reaction to the first sentence of said article, then I get it. But that's kind of the problem, isn't it? I never really bothered to answer the question, what is Hotep, until now, because, like I said, ain't really none of y'all's business who didn't already know. But then I realized that many of y'all who don't know, it really should be y'all's business, but y'all parents failed y'all somewhere in between Freaknik 93 and 94. I'm assuming that's a pretty hazy time in history. Y'all can ask Feek. He has firsthand experience. And don't let him tell you otherwise. Also, then that whole BS with Kyrie happened, and the internet decided that Hotep tree was now the greatest threat to American society since trans fats. I also didn't really realize how long people like Umar Johnson and Tariq Nasheed have been in at least the black public consciousness, and as a result, that right there is what a lot of y'all who don't know any better see in your mind's eye when you hear the word Hotep.
Lord have mercy. We must stay focused, brothers.
And that's all y'all see, and that's the issue. So this video isn't really for the woke whites in the audience. I'm not even really sure it's for a particular type of black in the audience either, that we'll talk about later on. But it's for y'all who don't know better, but wish that you did know what it really means to Hotep without all the outrage and reactionism around the term. And because this topic is way too densely packed for just one person to tackle, I had to put my pride aside and tag team the John, Goku and Vegeta style, with the only other self-identified Hotep on this platform that I could find that wasn't some combination of a crash out, a womanizer, or a figment of my own imagination. Yeah, it's the collab of the century that y'all been begging on bended knee for. Whatever. Cut to the dreadlock, nigga.
I guess let's start with your background, because your uncle or dad was a 5%er.
My sister's father was a 5%er for a while when he was in the streets, and I guess when my mom hooked up with him, that's where because by the time my mom had me, she was already saved, sanctified, all of that, whatever and whatnot. But prior to that was when she was exposed to all of that, daily maths and whatever and whatnot. And then my dad was never that's why I call him a diet Hotep.
So first of all, we have to talk about what a Hotep actually is, because 80% of the people using the term don't actually know because they're too busy writing a dissertation for their doctorate of collectivism to find out. Hotep is an Egyptian term, roughly meaning to be at peace. It was adopted roughly around the late 80s or 90s by Afrocentric black nationalists as a greeting in the same way as peace be with you. It just so happened that some of those black radicals had also co-opted Egyptian iconography as a source of black pride, because again, we don't really get taught African history in the States unless white people were involved with it. Thus, some people just put two and two together and said, well, Egypt is Africa after all, therefore it is historically black, because again, they didn't know or were taught any better by folk who did know better. Keep that part in mind for later on. By the time I got to college, however, so like the early 2010s, it became a placeholder for low-key problematic, simultaneously pseudo and anti-intellectual niggas who sold oils, didn't eat bacon, and sometimes wore funny-looking hats and glasses with non-prescription lenses, which these are not, by the way. And then Kyrie started burning sage, and around the same time, Kanye was going through like his third crash out of that year.
Every human being has something of value that they brought to the table, especially Hitler.
And Hotep suddenly became the biggest threat to American society since, well, the Jews, coincidentally enough. The history is a flat circle, remember?
I remember seeing Umar in 2010, in the early 2010s, popping up on Facebook with his poetry. Because that's where he got his start, doing, Pan-African poetry. And like, he had a little buzz, and then folks started noticing things not adding up, and then he had beef with other Hoteps and just little goofy stuff. And I feel like Umar's why the term Hotep became a pejorative term. I don't know if that's completely accurate, but I don't remember anybody using that term pejoratively until Umar.
Right.
And then Umar also created the lane for the Hotep influencer. That makes it so when Kyrie and Kanye do some Hotep shit, people not in the know can connect the dot.
Right.
And then when I bring up Du Bois or Touré or all these other people and talk about Pan-Africanism, they're like, oh, Hoteps. I'm like, no.
But in the back of your mind, you're like,
but not like you're thinking.
Right.
To the point that half of your favorite full-time bread tubers decided it was their civic duty to inform the public on this fringe school of black identity that had been being mocked and ridiculed within community since at least the 80s. And they proceeded to botch it because they weren't woke enough to consider actually talking to black folks about black folks' business before sounding the alarm for their fellow caulk-skinned collectivists. Y'all can kiss my black ass. So you probably gathered two things from the last paragraph. The first is that yes, this discourse does and always has pissed me off more than a Trump king. And the second is that Hotep is and has been black people's very own version of woke for at least the last 15 or so years. And just like woke, it is because the people who decided to turn it into a pejorative never bothered to figure out why the people they were pointing and laughing at thought the way that they did to begin with, because this is America in the 21st century after all. Your experience doesn't matter until and unless it validates my own. Again, y'all can kiss my black ass. Okay, so what do Hoteps actually believed in? That's really what we want to get at, right? Well, therein kind of lies the problem, folks. Hoteptry, like black nationalism from which it originates, is nebulous and encompasses a wide range of thought. For example, Nas, Ye, Jay, Kendrick Lamar, even basically every black rapper and even some white ones before So Far Gone drop can all be considered varying degrees of Hotep. This despite the fact that both Kendrick and Ye have only ever vocalized Christianity as their chosen identity. Comedians like Paul Mooney and Dave Chappelle, who identifies as Muslim, have in the past espoused some Hotep adjacent beliefs. And no, I'm not just talking about Dave's stance on trans issues. Matter of fact, Hoteps aren't at all exclusively male, and the fact that a lot of y'all perceive them as such is kind of the issue, low-key. Lauryn Hill and Erykah Badu immediately come to mind of women who fit squarely in that archetype of half spiritual, half pseudoscience type of black feminist identity politic that we think of when we hear Hotep, at least in terms of women. It's also no coincidence that both Lauryn and Erykah have a history of veiled misogyny masquerading as moralism, when both of them have their own histories of, let's just call them sordid affairs with some equally problematic men. My point is, There are religious Hoteps. There are atheist and agnostic Hoteps. There are Hoteps who believe that the earth is flat, and there are those who believe that we're living in a simulation. There are Hoteps whose politics are left-leaning, and those who are basically just black conservatives.
Especially Hitler.
There are male Hoteps, female Hoteps. There are MB Hoteps, hetero, gay, trans, whatever you want to name. When I was a kid, Hotep was just shorthand for that one nigga in the barbershop who just couldn't manage to have a normal conversation without turning it into some sort of performative protest of some sort. So y'all remember that time when Jaden Smith bemoaned the fact that all his 20-something-year-old friends rather talk about Pitchfork's best new music page than the impact of free zones on Jamaica's local economy?
Can we talk about like the political and economic state of the world right now?
Remember how we all wanted to throw tomatoes at him until he became allergic to the color red? Yeah, that's bread tube in a nutshell, but more importantly, that's the old school definition of a Hotep. Kobe's 80 piece or LeBron's decision became a diatribe against the plantation adjacency of pro-American sports. Discussing the newest 5 mic recipient became a lecture on the appropriation of black culture and the perpetuation of anti-black stereotypes by way of the music industry. See, the thing about Hoteps when I was growing up was as insufferable as they could be most times, they didn't really mean any harm and rarely ever caused any, at least not intentionally. Quite the opposite, in fact. Matter of fact, deep down in the back of most of our minds, the main reason why Hoteps annoyed us so much was because we all knew that they kind of had a point when you thought about it. But that's the thing. Don't nobody want to think that hard about their plight when they're sitting there getting their beard lined up. What I'm saying is, when I was a kid and a teenager for that matter, Huey Freeman and Furious Styles would have been called Hoteps along with Dr. Umar and Oswald Bates. If you really sit down and think about it, it's like, yeah, Huey kind of got to have he kind of have a point, but it's just that we at the barbershop talking about, LeBron. We talking about, we talking about Source Magazine and stuff like.
Sir, this is a Wendy's.
Right, exactly, sir. We ain't having that conversation. This is why when I mentioned Jimmy from Barbershop a while back, a lot of people mistook him for a Hotep because he would be one if not for one big difference in his personal politics. Like I said in the New Jack City video, Jimmy's problem is that he thinks himself above the hood and its residents, despite he being one himself. Jimmy's rhetoric may be Hotep adjacent, but his actual politics are more in line with black excellence, at least in the first movie they are. Hoteps when I was growing up were what I later learned academia calls black nationalists, and just like black nationalism, Hoteps come in a variety of codes and creeds, from Pan-Africanism to whatever the hell Umar Johnson is. However, as time went on and different forms of black nationalist thought began to actually be engaged, if not embraced by mainstream academia, Hotep became more and more associated with anti-intellectualism to the point of being virtually inextricable, but even that's not entirely accurate. Really, all a Hotep is someone who espouses some form of black nationalism in a way that is less than academically sound. Let's put it that way. If you think of black nationalism like a puzzle, they have part of the drawing complete, but there are a few pieces missing, so they wound up filling in the gaps with cut up pieces of an old cereal box. So because I know that this is not all family here, and there are some roaming white leftist TM in the comments now looking for a soundbite to clip and upload to your dying Discord servers, we have to talk very briefly about what black nationalism actually is and where it even comes from. Like I said earlier, if you just read the first sentence of Wikipedia and decided to base your next video's thumbnail on your initial reaction to that, and you know who you are, nigga, then you'd be forgiven in just assuming that black nationalism is just Nazism dipped in milk chocolate.
Especially Hitler.
I'm not going to sit here and pretend that the most extreme and conservative versions of black nationalists are basically just that, but that's the catch. In the same way that self-identified leftists, black, white, and everything else get bent like Joy Taylor when you assume that they are all just tankies, the same is true for black nationalists. In fact, just as with leftism, the spectrum is so broad that there's just as, if not more, infighting than actually fighting the power amongst black nationalist groups. I, for example, don't really have a name for my personal ideology, but on paper, I'm basically a Pan-Africanist, but not completely, which would make me an arch nemesis of the FBA and ADOS niggas, which unfortunately do fall under the black nationalist umbrella, at least according to their spoken goals and beliefs. But in actual practice, their ideology is really just garden variety conservatism with a progressive veneer, kind of like the Soviets, to be honest. But we're not getting too deep into that. So all of you Stanlinists and Mao apologists, y'all can have fun barking in the mirror in the comments, because I really don't care enough to debate y'all on that. And I'm sorry, I know I got some FBA folks in the audience, but hey, listen, I'm just keeping it a buck. Y'all are pretty much Republicans to me. At EOD, what black nationalists by and large believe is that African descended people represent a separate and distinct identity within racialized societies. Therefore, we have the right to representation and self-governance within those societies. Now, exactly what that looks like and how we get there differs greatly from sub-faction to sub-faction. For example, I tend to take the whole nationalist part pretty literally, you know, the whole nation within a nation thing that rose larger in response to the perceived failures of the civil rights movement. Like I said a few videos ago, I believe that integration puts limitation on liberation, when integration alone becomes the goal and not a means to achieving the goal of liberation. It's not enough to just be able to piss in the same toilet as a white person. It's not even enough to just settle for having more black faces in the halls of Congress or in the corporate boardrooms of America. Matter of fact, I'd argue that that's part of the problem right there. But what black people need to be truly free is cultural sovereignty, or the inherent right of group, as we understand it in regards to Native American studies. So yeah, I personally don't think that black people should have to pay taxes, because what did y'all do with the first like $12 trillion we gave y'all 250 years ago? That's pretty much what y'all said about crack too. So again, history is a flat circle, dummy. Admittedly, I may be on the more radical end of the spectrum, as a lot of black nationalists are satisfied with representation and at least the promise of self-sufficiency within the system as is. Again, for me, that's not good enough, and for a lot of folk like me, it ain't. Which now brings me to Marcus Garvey. Well, not quite yet, because despite what y'all didn't learn until college, black nationalism is just about as old as America herself, believe it or not. Like I said in the civil rights video, slave revolts were happening all the time from the beginning of the colonial period up to and through the American Civil War, and not just in America. The Caribbean is chock full of revolutionary roots as much as it is white people with very bad tan lines and shoddily built resorts and timeshares. There's the maroon communities of Jamaica. There's the origin of Carnival, which you thirsty dry dick mofos have turned into a passport bro convention, to the very existence of Haiti, and by extension everything bad that's ever happened in Haiti, because God forbid the dark-skinned stateside get any ideas from their cousins down south. I've also dedicated entire videos now to the revolutionary origin of the black church, so I won't dwell on that. But my point is, for as long as black people have been subjugated, black people have been using every outlet possible to establish and maintain an identity separate from the colonizer, once the colonizer stripped us of our ancestors' identity. That is the core ethos behind black nationalist thought, the creation and maintenance of black identity as defined by and for black people. It just so happens that some of us believe the only way to do that is separation from the people who stripped us of that identity to begin with. Which now leads me to Garvey. Not yet. That's a tease, right? Whatever. Martin Delaney, who I didn't even know existed until researching for this, was the first person to articulate black nationalism as I've defined it, or at least the first person that we know of. I'll spare y'all the behind the blackness because this video is already going to run well over what I wanted to, but Delaney experienced more than his fair share of micro and macro aggressions for that matter before finally just throwing in the towel on the whole integration thing, including being admitted to Harvard Med before being expelled 3 weeks later after a bunch of beige skins protested his admittance, presumably based on the presumption of his sexual prowess and their envy of it. Even before that, Delaney traveled to the South where he witnessed slavery for the first time. This on top of his own experience as a free black man in 19th century America, specifically his expulsion from Harvard, led him to becoming more radical in his views, concluding that white supremacists in the ruling class would never allow black people to become leaders within their society, regardless of how qualified those black people were. And I mean, real nigga, Hall of Fame. This led to him writing his first book, whose title is too long for me to write in this script, but whose message is so simple that it almost hurts. America, and Americans for that matter, never intended black people to do anything more than be a free and expendable workforce for the ruling class. Therefore, black people had no future in the US and were better off trying our luck somewhere where we'd at least be seen as human. So while Delaney is largely credited as the progenitor of modern black nationalism, I'd even argue that more importantly, he's probably the first person that we know of to articulate what modern academia would call Afro-pessimism. In 1854, Delaney, along with James Monroe Whitfield, established the National Immigration Convention in Cleveland, Ohio, where they, along with the rest of the attendees, accepted a resolution stating that 1, black people are equal to whites in every way besides sexual prowess, which we're obviously superior. 2, as equals, we demanded to be afforded every right and privilege afforded to white Americans. And 3, that we would attain these rights and accept nothing less in return. So yeah, this is the first draft of By Any Means Necessary, if there ever was one. I was serious about that real nigga Hall of Fame thing. Delaney did wind up making it to Liberia in 1859, but moved to London in 1860, right in time for the American Civil War, at which point he came back to the States and joined the Union forces and wound up attaining the highest rank a black man could in the army at the time. But all of that isn't really that relevant to his role in this story. Delaney isn't the first person to advocate for the whole back to Africa thing. He's probably not even the first to espouse Afro-pessimism or even just black nationalism. But he is the first person of his prominence that we know to do so, and to do so as forcefully and unequivocally as he did. Like I said in the past, the popular depiction of black people pre-Civil War and even up to and through the Civil Rights Movement is that of passivity, but that was just not the case. The reasons this has become the popular depiction I talked about in that whole civil rights video from a few months back with Martin Luther King on the title with a clickbait whatever. I know what you niggas click on. Y'all could go find it for yourself. But my point is, black nationalism and by extension Hoteps aren't something that just happened in the last like 15 to 20 years when most of y'all started paying attention to them. Which now finally, Jesus Christ, brings me to Marcus freaking Garvey, man. That took like forever. So Hoteptry, as understood by mainstream thought today, is primarily a product of a combination of the Nation of Islam, Jehovah's Witness theology, and most importantly for our discussion, at least right now, Garveyism. But let's start with the small fish before getting to, big king, black capitalism. Yeah, I know. Shut up and deal with it. More science teaches that all black people are descended from the biblical Moab, who himself is a product of incest between Lot and his 2 daughters, when those 2 daughters got their father drunk in order to impregnate them after seeing their mother turned into a pillar of salt while their hometown was struck by a meteor shower right after their father tried bartering their virginity to the hostile and horny populace in exchange for saving the booty holes of their 2 angelic guests. And I was going to make a trauma bonding joke here, but all I can think about is, Jesus Christ, why would you ever teach this in Sunday school? Man, it's no wonder we cut up the way that we did when we got out the house, pew babies. Anyway, the basic premise behind Moorish science is to instill a sense of identity in black people by drawing a cultural thread back to Africa, specifically North Africa, and thus Islam. The problem is that Islam, as practiced by more scientists, is less Islam than it is just Christian science, which itself is neither Christian nor scientific, and then it's mixed with a rudimentary, even romanticized interpretation of Sunni Islam, more science. So I'm going to skip the Jehovah's Witness tie-in for now because it's so small that it might as well just be lumped in with a bigger section, just like Hoteptry. That's kind of the point of this video, and jump right into the third person on your problematic cousin's pet tat portrait after Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad, that being Marcus freaking Garvey. Finally, the fourth man is, I don't know, either Kobe or Mike, depending on when and where he was born. That's not really important or relevant to any of this. Like I said in the past, Garvey, like the people he would inspire down the road, wasn't necessarily wrong in his observations. He was just wrong in how to address them. Garvey's primary concern was with establishing and promoting black identity outside of a white supremacist framework, being the primary advocate for the Pan-Africanism and Back to Africa movements in his time. What he envisioned was a unified one-party Africa with him as the head nigga in charge until death. And again, like I said, halfway right. Probably my biggest criticism of Garvey, though, is his love affair with white supremacist economic systems. Garvey was a big capitalist and saw it as a means for black people to accumulate communal wealth. So what we would call social capitalism today. Basically, Garvey was Killer Mike with a plan, or Jay-Z with scruple, is what I'm saying. As a result, Garvey did not like Du Bois based on both their stances on economics and integration and vice versa. That's also something to keep in mind for later. Garvey also considered far-right whites a better potential ally than the moderates or white leftists because in his mind, the Klansmen not only were more honest about their stance on race issues, but they had the shared goal of shipping the Negroes back to where they came and creating separate black and white societies. Remember how I said a few videos ago about Garvey being the first person to articulate what we would call entrance convergence? This is what I was talking about. Garvey was nothing if not pragmatic. So if getting his Pan-Africanist utopia meant allying with the cousin humpers, then so be it. But here is where Garveyism becomes contradictory to me. Liberation through black capitalism would appeal primarily to those who already have the resources to pursue it. The under and working class then and now are disproportionately colored. My point being, even if the goal is communal wealth accumulation, by adhering to a capitalist model, you're going to wind up exploiting both the labor and the wealth of black people, regardless of what your intention is. So at best, you just create a new ruling elite with darker skin, wider hips, and fuller lips. So you make Atlanta, basically. And this explains why so many Hoteps do tend to be pro-capitalist despite their socioeconomic status many times. It's kind of hard not to draw parallels between the whole just buy black thing that's not strictly a Hotep thing and Garveyism. Now, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that at least parts of my personal politics don't mirror Garvey's or are even inspired by Garvey. I mean, I was raised by a nigga with an Elijah Muhammad portrait in his front room, after all. But again, I think he was only halfway right. Garvey was correct in his suspicion of white allies, primarily left-leaning ones. He was also right to criticize white communists for neglecting racial justice and the whole racial component of oppression, period, and calling communism a white man's movement, at least the way that it was practiced by Western communists. And, I mean, yeah, kudos for that, Garvey. However, what he failed to do was to make the same criticism of capitalism, which, if you ask me, is an even wider economic framework than communism is. You can't be a capitalist and not benefit from working class labor or just the existence of an underclass. It just don't work. There's got to be haves and have-nots. Thus, even if in theory the end goal is the advancement of the entire black body politic, in practice, black capitalists inevitably wind up exploiting other black people to do so. And at best, they end up right back at square one. Especially in Garvey separatist society, the exploited class will always be black, and in this instance will be exclusively so. So then who really benefits besides Atlanta again? Okay, but what y'all really want to know is, where does all the pseudo-spiritual goofery come from? More importantly, the misogyny, the homophobia, the anti-Semitism, that's really the main issue that makes Hoteptry problematic for most folk, right? It comes from Farrakhan. I'm just gonna keep it a buck. I'm sorry, y'all. Please leave me alone. I promise I will buy a bean pie the next time that I'm at the train station. I might even pick up some oils from my father-in-law. I got kids, man. Come on, dog. All right, so like I said earlier, the Nation of Islam is an amalgamation of more science, Garveyism, and pseudo-Christianity. But how did all of these seemingly disparate ideologies come together to form the bow tie and bean pie brigade? All right, so be forewarned, this is where it starts getting equal parts crazy, scary, spooky, and hilarious. So again, to any black Muslims in the audience, I don't mean to offend y'all. I'm just trying to be as scholarly as possible with this, John. I promise y'all I won't come anywhere near Broad and Lehigh for like the next 6 months. I promise. So it all comes back to this nigga Wallace Farad Muhammad, who we're not even 100% sure was even nigga. So that's already one antenna up. Anyway, Farad just kind of appeared in Detroit in 1930, and his followers claimed July 4th as the actual date of his arrival. So there's no way on God's great earth that was at all a coincidence. Farad started out by selling silks door to door to black folks, claiming them to be the same kind worn by their Moorish ancestors back in Mecca, as well as advising his black clientele on certain foods that they should be eating, which, I mean, considering the number of type 2 diabetics among the big mama and pop demographic, you gotta give him flowers for that at least. As a result, people started inviting him back to their homes to share his Afrocentric teaching with them. Farad taught from the Bible initially to support his ideology, but as his denouncement of white supremacy and whiteness became more vociferous, he wound up switching to the Quran and even began denouncing the Bible itself, thus the conflation of Christian and Islamic ideas espoused by NOI ministers. Or at least this is one of the more accepted theories. That'll make sense the further we go along. Farad also frequently taught from a book called The Bible of Islamisms. This we know for a fact, which was later identified as the Jehovah's Witness text titled Deliverance at Hand. And there is the Jehovah's Witness tie-in from before. I told y'all it wasn't that big a deal. Farad encouraged his followers to drop their surnames and adopt Muslim ones, as he had, a practice that he possibly, or more than likely probably, inherited from Noble Drew Ali of the Moorish Science Temple, but we ain't get there yet. According to sociologist Erdman Doan Benyon, in the 3 years from his arrival to his departure in 1934, Farad converted somewhere around 8,000 people to his teachings, to the point that he rarely ever appeared to them in person by the end, and his teachings still gained new adherents by the day. And here is where the scary / spooky part of the story comes in. I'm not really going to get into the nitty-gritty details here. This is more Trap Lord Ross's lane. But in 1932, Farad was subject to federal investigation as part of the so-called Voodoo murder. On November 20th, 1932, Robert Kareem, aka Robert Harris, escorted James J. Smith to a room where awaiting him were 12 adult witnesses, along with Smith's wife and children, along along with a makeshift altar. Smith was asked if he would sacrifice his life for Islam, at which point he nodded yes, and Kareem responded by stabbing him in the chest and beating him to death with an axle rod. When questioned by police, Kareem admitted to the murder, saying, quote, "I had to kill somebody. I could not forsake my gods." So where then does Farad come into all of this? Well, like I said, Kareem was formerly known as Harris, and the one who bestowed him with his new surname was none other than Farad himself. Therefore, he, along with another leader of the Allah Temple of Islam, Yugan Ali, were arrested and interrogated, at which point they vehemently denied teaching human sacrifice. That really didn't matter, though, as a psychiatrist recommended that they be committed until the trial, during which Kareem pled guilty to first-degree murder, but wound up being declared legally insane because, I mean, duh, nigga. Yugan Ali was released and cleared of any criminal charges on the condition that the Allah Temple be disbanded. Likewise, Farad was let free on the condition that he leave Detroit for good, which he did immediately upon release, just not for good. In the wake of the voodoo murder scandal, the Allah Temple was disbanded, but Farad's disciples reorganized under a new name and leader, the Nation of Islam, and their leader being the former Elijah Poole, also former Elijah Kareem, now Elijah Muhammad. Kind of see where things are about to get murkier than a Louisiana bayou. If not, know that Farad wound up coming back to Detroit the next year, and according to Binion, kind of ran the NOI from the shadows, even giving it its new name. During this time, he also instituted much of the structure it has even to this day, including the Muslim girls training and general civilization class and the paramilitary wing of the org, the Fruit of Islam. Farad went through a pattern of preaching against a white man, being arrested, and then being released for the next 2 or so years before establishing an alternative school for kids in the NOI. He was finally exiled for good after Detroit police noted a pattern of truancy in the school system and raided Farad's school in March of 1934. Once they made the connection that the kids were missing were, Nation of Islam kids. At the trial, Sally Ali, a student of the school, testified that she had been taught that, quote, if she cut off the heads of 4 devils being unrighteous people, she would win a free trip to Mecca and a button of some sort, as well as the fact that Caucasian, white people would be destroyed by poison gas and fighting in 1934. And I mean, not exactly wrong.
Especially
Farad was convicted of establishing and running an unlicensed school and wound up fleeing Detroit for good after rumors began that the police chief wanted him dead, which, I mean, white people overreacting to fringe black identity movements is kind of the whole point of this video, right? The spookiest part of all of this, though, is that the only confirmed photos we have of Farad are from his many arrests during this period. Matter of fact, Farad is alleged to have had at least 58 different aliases over his lifetime. Some say Farad was a black man from the U.S. South just looking to establish a new black identity politic in the wake of the ever-present race science movement of the early 20th century. Some say he was a Persian man named Alam Khan who traveled to the U.S. from British India in 1904. Some say he was a Turkish tamale vendor from Oregon, and the feds say that he was either a Nazi sleeper agent or Wally Dodd Ford, a former inmate at San Quentin who claimed Afghanistan, Hawaii, and New Zealand as his birthplace at different times prior to becoming Wallace Farad Muhammad. Although this last one is vehemently denounced by the NOI, and if you ask me, was probably just another in a long list of examples of the feds using every attempt to undermine black nationalism. So thanks in large part to Carl Evans, a former New York Times writer and author of several books on the Nation of Islam, the public kind of sort of accepts that Wally D. Ford and Wallace Farad Muhammad are the same person, but I don't buy that for a few reasons. According to research done by Dr. Wesley Muhammad, who, full disclosure, is a Nation of Islam minister, the Ford to Farad connection had more to do with the Fed's continued attempts to dismantle black power than it did actually finding out who this nigga actually was. We know that as far back as 1939, the Feds were surveilling the NOI, linking the group with the Japanese Black Dragon Society. In the same year, Hoover got an executive order to detain Elijah Muhammad for instructing his followers to oppose the war. During his detainment, Muhammad cited Farad as the reason behind his opposition, stating that his mentor instructed his followers not to register for the draft. The Feds then contacted Detroit police to look into Farad's true identity, at which point they discovered arrest records for a, quote, white Arabian man named Wallace Farad dating from 1933. And based on eyewitness accounts from his disciples, this is what Farad looked like, the fair-skinned Arabian man.
This Farad nigga, man, and he might not even be black. That's the thing. He might not even be black.
He might be Malaysian.
he might. No, for real.
There's no mention of Wally D. Ford in FBI search results between 1942 and 43. Ford doesn't come up even until 1957, when Hoover's rage boner against black power was just about fully bricked.
Hello.
It was in 57 that the Feds searched the name Wallace Ford in INS records based on the Binion article I mentioned earlier. One of the two names that turned up was the Wally D. Ford that spent time in San Quentin in the mid-1920s. But even the Feds weren't ever able to conclude definitively that this Ford was also Farad. Additionally, the FBI fabricated a story in 1958 saying that Farad was a Turkish-born Nazi agent who, upon meeting Elijah Muhammad in a Michigan prison, conceived the NOI as an elaborate religious scheme meant to deter black people from that good old American dream. So here is my thing. As Dr. Muhammad states, if the Feds knew that Wally D. Ford and Wallace Farad were the same person in 1957, why would they fabricate a story in 1958 in order to discredit him when the truth would have been just as, if not more damning, and also true? In fact, the Feds conducted a search in Hawaii and an investigation in New Zealand based on Ford's self-reported birthplaces. Not only did they not find anything in Hawaii, but the one family they found in New Zealand with the last name Ford denied recognizing the one confirmed mugshot of Farad that the Feds used for their investigation, at which point the Feds closed it and determined Farad's origin as being inconclusive, which would directly contradict Evans's conclusion. Now, this next part is pretty much where I gave up doing any more digging because the rabbit hole is deeper than Prince's discography. So if you want the whole story or details or whatever, I'll link Dr. Muhammad's article in the description. So if you Google the name Wallace Farad Muhammad, most likely the first photo that comes up is this mugshot from his 1933 arrest. Matter of fact, it's one of a literal handful of confirmed photos we have of Farad, except this isn't Farad, and it's not from 1933. This is the mugshot taken of Wally D. Ford from his 1926 arrest. We know this because in 1963, writer Ed Montgomery identified it as such in his article, Muslim Founder, White Masquerader, except that at the time that article was published, the 1933 date was not on the photo. Matter of fact, there was no date on it at all. It wasn't until Montgomery published a follow-up article in 1965 that we see the photo with the 1933 arrest date scribbled on it. And it was that photo that Evans uses in his book. To further thicken the plot, when Dr. Muhammad requested Farad's file from Detroit police in 2002, he got the same, in my opinion, doctored photo as Farad's official mugshot. In Muhammad's words, quote, "The answer to this mystery is likely provided in a June 2nd, 1971 memo in the Chicago SAC concerning a, quote, destruction project. during which pre-1961 files and photos associated with Wallace Farrad's investigation were destroyed. The memo notes, quote, "In regards to 1A file, only one photo and or negative was retained of photos prior to 1961, end quote. According to an indices search slip dated May 5th, 1957, all the FBI files on Farrad were destroyed that same year, supporting the idea that this was all just some taxpayer-funded cap. My point in all of this amateur sleuthing is to prove a point that I'll elaborate further on in the video, and more importantly, what this entire joint revolves around pretty much. That black radicalism is almost never acknowledged, let alone engaged by mainstream religious, political, even academic thought until and unless it is, in the words of Hoover himself, to quote, disrupt, discredit, or dismantle it. And that's almost always only after it's proven itself a threat to white supremacy, even if a marginal one. But as far as Farrad goes, the truth is no one really knows where this nigga came from or who he really is or where he ultimately wound up aside from Elijah Muhammad. So again, grain of salt. To the point that the man is basically a ghost, and that became even more true under Elijah's leadership, during which Farrad was effectively deified. What's perhaps more important is that Elijah is largely responsible for the NOI spread to the East Coast, which is how the black populations of cities like New York and Philly basically became inextricable from black Muslims throughout my youth, at least, eventually leading to offshoot ideologies like the 5%er nation. But I'm going to let Feek handle that part if he feels like it. Oh, and also Malcolm happened during this period. I kind of forgot about Malcolm, you know. Hey. In my opinion, there's probably no more important singular figure in the history of black power in America than Malcolm X. And that was kind of the problem. The NOI's membership increased from around 1,200 to at least 50,000 and upwards of 100,000 during Malcolm's time as a minister. And again, that's just the Nation of Islam, not counting the adjacents. In a lot of ways, the tall, handsome, charismatic Malcolm was everything that Elijah Muhammad was not, which made him just as fascinating as he was feared by both the feds and his surrogate father figure. The media rarely, if ever, wanted to speak to Elijah. They wanted Malcolm, which rubbed Elijah the wrong way, to the point of he playing foil to Malcolm anytime he wanted to do anything besides yap, if for no other reason than to assert his authority over his young protege. Probably the main difference between the two was that Malcolm off rip was about that action, boss, and wasn't afraid to let it be known. The first signs of division between he and Elijah came in light of an incident in April of 1962 when LAPD officers assaulted a group of black Muslims outside of Muhammad Mosque 27 unprovoked. One member, William X. Rogers, was shot and paralyzed, and another, Ronald Stokes, was also shot and killed after surrendering to police. Well, remember how I keep saying there's no zealot like a convert? Yep, Malcolm, being an ex-street nigga after all, rallied fellow black Muslims of similar backgrounds or at least similar mindsets to get their lick back from the pigs. Until they were stopped by Elijah, a man who made his livelihood preaching about the coming recompense of the white race, ironically enough. This understandably flabbergasted Malcolm, but at least it could be rationalized to him. What couldn't be rationalized, however, was when Elijah rebuffed Malcolm, tossing around the idea of the NOI working with other black religious and civil rights groups and even local politicians. The final fissure between the two came after Malcolm, who was once Elijah's greatest advocates, confirmed accusations of both infidelity and child rape against his mentor. This came after he spoke with both Elijah's son, Wallace, and Elijah himself about the incident, or incidents rather. This in addition to the NOI's denouncement of his statements following the assassination of JFK and his suspension from the org for the same thing convinced Malcolm that the NOI had, in his own words, gone as far as it can, and he formally departed the org in 1964. Oh, and he also conducted a bunch of nationally televised interviews saying that Elijah was a kid diddler and was also trying to kill him.
Cause I heard that nigga was a kid diddler. Yeah, I heard that nigga was a pedophile.
Yeah, that totally did not factor into his untimely demise. And I think it bears mentioning that for as far back as 1936, Muhammad was being funded by a white supremacist oil tycoon, H.L. Hunt. Remember what I said about Garvey being open to working with white nationalists? Well, the apple don't fall too far from the tree now, does it? This is pretty much the same deal, but still, I mean, come on, man. The man who was once described as Black Hitler is on a Klansman's payroll. Like, all I'm saying is that Malcolm had any number of reasons to break off from the org, all of which were justified, all of which are probably why he didn't live to see 40, but I'm not going to get into any of that because I still do. After Elijah's death, his son Wallace took over and reformed the NOI to become closer to just being straight up Sunni Muslim, rejecting a lot of the dumb stuff that OG NOI niggas believed, like, you know, Yaqub and us being, you know, the lost tribe of Shabazz or whatever. However, a conservative faction sprung up in response and reorganized once again, this time under the leadership of former Calypso singer Louis Eugene Walcott, aka Louis X, now known as Louis Farrakhan.
My dad hated Farrakhan. You know, he used to talk bad about Farrakhan all the time, in a way that he was so proud of me when I made that video. He was like, I'm so happy that stuff, you know, because he was on to something. My father got a lot of issues, but he was on to something with his Farrakhan critique.
And that's pretty much the history of the NOI in a nutshell, up to like the, I don't know, early mid 70s. What basically, kinda. I got all the important bits in there. You know, we're not going to talk about Farrakhan being a Scientologist.
Scientologist. I'll leave it for your video. I didn't even know he got to Scientology, but I'll leave it for you. I know they believe in spaceships.
Oh, y'all ain't know that? Yeah, but Farrakhan is a Scientologist, low key. Okay, so now that we've gotten to this point, we got to clear up a few blurry patches, right? One, the NOI doesn't necessarily come from Garveyism, straight up, especially if you do accept the theory that Farad was a southern-born black man who migrated to the north in the mid to late 1920s. Although the UNIA and thereby Garveyism did have a bit of a presence in the South, at least more of a presence than the NAACP had, in other words, none, it wasn't so much that most Southern blacks would have had prior exposure to it before migrating north. And by the time they did, Garvey was already back in Jamaica after doing a bid for tax evasion. Rather, like Garvey, these blacks who had been exposed to a lifetime of race-based degradation, who were being taught that black inferiority was just biological, rejected the white man's version of race science and overcorrected in the most obvious way possible, using religion to justify that overcorrection. They just wound up drawing the same conclusions that Garvey did about black enterprise being the key to autonomy and eventually sovereignty, because that's really all they had been exposed to by the dying days of American leftism. But if you do want my take, Hotep tree is Garveyism by way of Moorish science. This is supported, I think, by the many parallels between Moorish science and NOI beliefs, like the whole being a Moor thing. Drew Ali formed his first temple in Newark, New Jersey in 1913, so just in time for Garvey to arrive stateside and start spreading his social capitalist gospel. It's also likely that this is how and when Drew Ali transitioned from Christian to Muslim adjacency by way of the Ahmadiyya Muslim movement. Long story short, the Ahmadiyya movement is the Muslim equivalent to end times Christianity, and as part of their belief system, they believe that true Islam must be restored and purged of the corrupting influences that it has taken on in this centuries-long history. And as with millennialist Christian doctrines, part of this restoration means evangelizing the entire world before the coming of the Messiah. According to Dr. Fatima Fanusi, Ahmadiyya evangelization of Europe and North America occurred in 5 phases over the course of the late 19th and early to mid 20th centuries. The most important for our story being the second phase. This phase coincided with the popularization of eugenics and race science in the Western world, and the Ahmadiyya recognized this and began denouncing these, and as well as just straight up racism period in general, in an effort to appeal to ethnic minorities of the West, among them Black Americans. Matter of fact, according to historian Mikhail Gomez, we have evidence that Drew Ali was in fact approached by Ahmadi missionaries sometime in the 1920s, right around the time that his movement was becoming less Christian and more Muslim, at least aesthetically it was. So putting the pieces of the puzzle together, we can ascertain that Drew Ali was drawn to Islam through the Ahmadiyya, but somehow only got the pro-black parts of the message and pasted that over top of Christian Science, and yeah, that's how we get the first true blue Hoteps in America. From that point until the mid-1920s, Drew Ali was planning temples further and further west before finally settling in Chicago. The Moorish temple, unlike the NOI, however, wasn't antagonistic to whiteness or white people. Rather, Drew Ali taught his disciples to embrace love and reject hate for any and everyone, along with rejecting labels like black, colored, and Negro, encouraging them to adopt names that will reflect their Moorish heritage. So if you ever met somebody with the last name Bey or El, yeah, that's from Moorish science. He also taught them to start wearing clothing traditionally associated with the Middle East, like fezzes and turbans. Y'all starting to see the connection between that and the NOI now, right? By the late 1920s, the Moorish Science Temple had over 35,000 members across the Northeast, Midwest, and Upper South, and had developed a pretty positive reputation, particularly in Chicago, in large part due to they helping build black enterprise in a similar manner as Garvey's UNIA earlier in that same decade. In fact, Garvey is singled out and venerated in Moorish science lore to the point of being damn near deified. But that's not all, folks. In 1920, Mufti Muhammad Sadiq was sent to the States to proselytize Islam to the North American heathen, at which point he was promptly detained for being a dark-skinned Indian man, because, I mean, duh, nigga. It was here that Sadiq was confronted with and realized the potential of anti-blackness as a recruiting tool, and began preaching to blacks by contrasting Islam's teachings on racism with what he perceived and low-key kind of clocked as Western Christianity's inherent white male supremacy. In fact, according to an article by Aisha Khan, Sadiq wound up becoming friendly with Garvey to the point of preaching to and converting a good number of UNI members to Islam. This is how and why Islam in America was damn near inextricable from blackness until like the second half of the 20th century, because its ministers, who themselves were ostracized by mainstream Islam, saw the potential of recruiting from the out and undercast. Y'all starting to see where this is going, right? Probably not, and that's kind of my point again. Matter of fact, Moorish temple members were frequently singled out for praise in Chicago newspapers. Drew Ali himself was invited to attend the inauguration of Lewis Emerson, the governor of Illinois, in 1929. However, that same year, Claude Green Bay, the business manager for the Chicago temple, was stabbed to death after declaring himself Grand Sheik of a new temple and leading an exodus from the Chicago temple while Drew Ali was away dealing with one of his supporters. Drew Ali was arrested and questioned in relation to the murder, but ultimately released before dying under suspicious circumstances himself not too long after. And this is where Wallace Farad re-enters the chat and things kind of go sideways. So a bunch of potential successors to Drew Ali stepped forward immediately after his passing, resulting in sort of a civil war within the movement. I'm not really going to get into too much detail, but what's important is that there's a general consensus, even if not universal, that this is when a man named David Ford L steps forward as not only the rightful successor of Ali, but the reincarnate Ali himself. After being rejected, 4L left Chicago for Detroit and began espousing his teachings to the black citizens there under the new name of Wallace Farad Muhammad, allegedly again. It's almost impossible to prove any of this definitively, even if all of the circumstantial evidence makes sense. And again, the similarities between the two are too uncanny to be coincidence, especially for fringe identities. The Moorish temple again teaches for men to cover their heads with fezzes and women with turbans, just like the NOI. Ali claimed that black people were descended from the biblical Moabites, a West Asiatic people, and referred to all dark-skinned people, regardless of ethnic or national origin, as Asiatic. In the same way, the NOI describes black people as being Asiatic people of the lost tribe of Shabazz. More science practitioners today acknowledge the conflict that exists between they and the NOI over the connection. But even Farrakhan himself at least acknowledges that there is a connection, even going so far as to honor Drew Ali when speaking on the NOI's origins. And here's where I really wanted to get at with this video. You notice how Ali and Farad's audience were made up primarily, if not exclusively, from poor to working class black people living in the slums of the big cities, many of whom had just migrated from the South and really had no other recourse. That wasn't by accident, bucko. Whether you want to argue that one or both of Ali and Farad just made a living and legacy off of using identity politics to grip the vulnerable population, Tariq Nasheed, is irrelevant to the fact that they provided something to the working class that many, if not most, of the black bourgeoisie still have no interest in giving: an answer and an outlet. So now we got to talk about black power, more specifically its similarities to and differences from the NOI and thereby Hoteptry. Like I said earlier, black power and Hoteptry are basically first cousins, except one got a football scholarship to insert HBCU of your choosing, and the other wound up copping a bid over an OZ that wasn't even his and wound up becoming a street preacher after said bid. Both ideologies are critical of mainstream thought systems, both secular and spiritual. Both espouse the belief in redefining what black identity is outside of white supremacy. But most importantly, both primarily targeted the working and underclass of black America. The difference is, while black power made room for spirituality, it was not a wholly spiritual movement, whereas the NOI and the Moorish temple, for that matter, are actual religions, meaning that there is much less flexibility insofar as questioning standard beliefs and practices from within. For example, black power stance on women and queers evolved the further it was challenged by women and queers within the movement, to the point that the leaders of the black power movement threatened discipline against anyone who espoused or practiced misogyny and or homophobia within their ranks. Which, I mean, Eldridge Cleaver has entered the chat, but my point is black power was willing to change to the point that by its nadir, women were leading not just from the rear but from the front this time. That wasn't happening in the NOI, and it ain't happening because Allah said. Additionally, the main goal of black power was redefining blackness outside of a white supremacist framework, while the NOI really just seeks to establish racial equity between black and whiteness within our current framework. The NOI, being a religious movement, doesn't need any further justification for its ideology beyond God said, thus interpreting God as one of static order as opposed to justice, in a similar fashion as Western Christianity, which ironically makes Hotep ideology a lot closer to the white man's religion than what black Christianity has been historically. I mean, can't really say that today. Again, we're talking pre-civil rights, y'all. This is supported by the NOI's adherence to patriarchal hierarchy, homophobia, race science, and social capitalism. The NOI is focused primarily, matter of fact, exclusively on the elevation of black men. Again, supporting the idea of equity within the current framework as opposed to liberation from it. By elevating the black man, you elevate the collective in the process. Again, going back to that whole Judeo-Christian Islamic interpretation of gender roles and what have you. Lastly, and I know this is going to piss some of y'all off, the NOI is not, nor was it ever, a revolutionary movement. If anything, it is and always has been counter-revolution under the guise of black nationalism for the reasons I just stated. It is aesthetically and rhetorically pro-black, but in practice, it's really a lot more anti-black. Like I said earlier, the NOI doesn't seek equity for Black People University. Its goal in practice is that Black men achieve the same type of patriarchal privilege that white men have, and in doing so, elevate Black women to a status that is currently held by white women, kinda, even if that, not really. I'm really giving grace with that. It's not meant to tear down any current framework again. Rather, it's meant to remove Blackness as a disqualifier within the current one. And okay, that's all well and good, but circumstantial evidence isn't enough to convict. Hell, material evidence ain't enough. If you're rich and or white enough, and even then it doesn't matter so long as you get enough idiots to vote you into public office after royally botching the worst public health crisis since the Spanish freaking flu. Golly, I cannot wait for y'all lepers ate my face moment. So as I said in the past, by the mid to late 80s, Black power was effectively finished, with all its leaders either dead, in jail, or in exile. Coincidentally or consequently, depending on who you ask, this was around the time that respectability became the most desirable depiction of Blackness in America, to the point of being basically the only one taken seriously. In no small part because of folks like Cliff and Claire Huxtable, Oprah Winfrey, the Winslow family, etc.
There was a very intentional flanderizing of Black Black Pan-African radical ideology from essentially the 80s until now. And sadly, major grifters, scammers, exploiters, abusers, and cult leaders. So which, what sane dude would look deeper into that?
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, I don't want to be a goofy Hotep using big words I don't understand and then getting with a white woman, which exists.
Right.
Also, some of these niggas is cult leaders and is having sex with children.
It's no coincidence then that the popular depiction of Black nationalism in popular media during this time became dismissive at best. Characters like Oswald Bates, Bro from Don't Be a Menace, Amal from Sister Act 2 were harmless on the surface, but helped reinforce the idea that radicalism had overstayed its welcome. Even the Mau Mau's from Bamboozle, who are at least given that whole broken clock treatment, can be argued are a precursor to the modern depiction of Hoteptry. Therein lies the twist. Oswald Bates was always depicted as either being incarcerated or recently released. Amal went to an inner city parochial school on the verge of shutting down due to a lack of funding. What I'm saying is these characters came from places that to that point and even today were and are largely ignored by not just white leftists, but the Black bourgeoisie, and thus did not have access to the kind of education and resources to connect the dots of their condition with the system responsible. Again, they had the pieces of the puzzle, but they didn't know how to put them together, and further had no one to show them how. No one except the Nation of Islam and its offshoots. I'm not going to dwell too long here, but from the 80s into the 90s, the NOI was the loudest voice for Black nationalism in America, aside from, I don't know, probably Public Enemy, who themselves point back to the NOI as being a primary source for their. You see it. How everything comes full circle, right? That's why people like me and those who raise me will and do acknowledge Farrakhan's problematicness, while also acknowledging that he's largely responsible for introducing us to Black power, even in the warped and mutated state that it was. Again, going back to the 5%er nation, have you ever asked yourself why so much of that rhetoric and iconography is basically embedded into hip-hop culture? It's because they come from the same place, the urban centers of America, where no one but those people who already lived there dared to venture until poverty tourism became a sustainable business model. Again, y'all got to ask Trap Blue or Ross about that. So if it sounds like I'm blaming the Black middle and upper class for the creation of Hoteptry, it's because, nigga, I am. And so did Fanon. And he married a white John. So, yeah, considering the subject matter, it all tracks. In Black Skin, White Mask, Fanon argued that the underclass, who we would call the lumpen proletariat, is the most intellectually independent from the dominant ideology of this society. Specifically, he was talking about the peasantry within colonial societies. He also argued black people are incapable of full assimilation into colonized culture as a result of our colonized status. The colonized lack a national identity for obvious reasons. And in the case of black people, we are so disconnected from the identity of our ancestors that we will appropriate the culture of the colonizer in an attempt to form our own identity. Thus, the black bourgeoisie is much more susceptible than the under and working class to donning the proverbial white mask, in that they have a greater capacity for consumption, and consumption is the easiest, the most obvious marker of privilege that there is. And again, privilege equals whiteness in a white supremacist society. I've talked about Herbert Marcuse probably more than any black academic, honestly, but it bears repeating that according to Marcuse, the middle, and for that matter the working class today, honestly, are in a collective state of what he calls false consciousness, that predicated on the acquisition and accumulation of what he calls false needs, i.e. consumer goods. This false consciousness conditions those classes to be preoccupied with keeping up with consumer culture to the point of neglecting to ask, why the hell are we even doing this to begin with, let alone asking how the hell do we break out of this pattern, creating a condition which he calls one-dimensional thought. My point is that Marcuse basically co-signed Fanon in that the underclass is both the most intellectually independent and revolution ready of the classes, as they lack the means to participate in consumer culture and thus be sedated by it. And this is basically the ethos of black power and the strategy that the NOI use, even if unintentionally. Black people conscious of our limited access to privilege relative to the dominant ideology, i.e. white supremacy, are more likely to revolt against it. This is especially true the lower your tax bracket is as a black or brown person. This is why, like I have said ad nauseum, black people, women, and queers especially have been on the front lines of every even left of center movement in the States, and the joint always falls apart once white people just start getting a little bit of crumbs from off of masses table and decide that we're good for now, boss. Thus, much like the NOI that inspired them, the primary purpose of Hoteps is the equity of black identity to white identity within the current order. In order to do that, Hoteps overcorrect for historical anti-blackness in the same way that the NOI does, by literally turning the racial dichotomy of white supremacy upside down. But in doing so, Hoteptry just takes the master's tools and puts a bizarro pendant on them. So all of that being said, let's get down to the real reason we hold so much disdain for Hoteps, even more so than for equally problematic non-black folk, I'd argue. For as problematic as their ideology is, Hoteps and the groups that inspired them and composed them are a fringe movement within black nationalism, and even more so in black identity politics as a whole. Many within the mainstream, ergo white society, weren't even aware of Hotep's existence until Kyrie and Kanye took the most problematic parts of that ideology mainstream, or at least this was the first time that that ideology was engaged intellectually. The response by many whites on both the left and right side of the spectrum was indicative of anti-blackness on both sides. Because again, where was this smoke when those Tea Party pricks were walking around with signs of Obama with a bone going through his septum? They're running a White House now. In this regard, Hoteps like Garvey and even like Farrakhan before them are correct in their Afro-pessimistic worldview, that mainstream political thought will always be dismissive at best and more often than not antagonistic to any form of black identity politics until and unless it proves itself compliant with white supremacy. This is why historically respectability has always had the edge over black radicalism as its depiction, and therefore proliferation and popularity within mainstream political thought. Just think about the way that MLK's legacy has been whitewashed to the point that many young black radicals, including myself in my early 20s until I took that one class in undergrad, hold him with such disdain for assuming that he was just a Uncle Tom house nigga. And understand something, I'm not saying it's only white people who think this way. Many among the black intellectual class, having been educated and thereby conditioned with a white supremacist worldview, are equally, as if not more, antagonistic to black radical thought, and therefore choose not to engage with it seriously until their white friends tell them that it's worthy of doing so. Hoteps have been saying and believing the same thing for at least like 40 years. But it wasn't until like the last decade or so that we started taking it seriously enough to think piece on, let alone engage with it. When famous people started saying stuff that made white people and the blacks trying to emulate them uncomfortable. It's important to reiterate that this form of black identity politics has been around in some form since the 1910s at the latest. And they were even respected to varying degrees for their civic engagement and promotion of black identity, despite their anti-intellectual and problematic ideas. But now, after a bunch of niggas who grew up in gated cul-de-sacs saw a 19 Keys video for the first time, now all of a sudden we decide it's time to throw the baby out with the bathwater because the new blacks in the boule said so. And that's where I'm getting at with this video, y'all. I've referenced this article from Current Affairs magazine by Bertrand Cooper several times now, to the point that it was basically the basis of my last video. But in the first half, he makes the point that most white Americans don't have close enough relationships with black people to actually know black people, if they have relations with them at all. Therefore, they base most of their knowledge on blackness on the way media depicts it, which again, I've already done that video a few times now, and I generally don't expect better from mainstream media at this point, to be real. The thing is, this is just as true for race as it is class, something I also talked about last month. But specifically as it pertains to this conversation here, many, I dare even say most middle to upper class blacks don't bother interacting with working and underclass blacks to actually know what being black and poor is like. Instead, they base their perceptions of poverty on what they see and hear in TV, movies, and music, to the point of open antagonism to the black working class. And if I'm wrong, ask yourself the last time that a fellow black American called you broke, jobless, or ghetto as an insult, in the same way that those very same broken, jobless niggas and niggettes use sassy and zesty as one. Y'all see what I did there, right? Full circle again, nigga. Like I said, in the hood is dead. Literally half the gun crimes committed in an average American city are committed by a fraction of a percent of that city's population. And that fraction represents what are called so-called street groups, which coincidentally also represents over half the victims of said crimes. In other words, street niggas doing street stuff. But most of y'all don't know that because you listen to GKMC or you watch Menace to Society that one time and assume that everybody from the hood just pops out of the womb with a blick tied to their umbilical cord. Again, most middle class people's knowledge of Hoteptry was and still is limited to media. It's just that when that media became social, y'all based your interactions with real life Hoteptry on what you saw in Sister Act 2 and in Living Color. In other words, y'all never took these niggas seriously to begin with. They were always a punchline to some of y'all, and you never bothered to engage them intellectually because they weren't worth the effort until your white dorm mates and co-workers said they were. There's a not insignificant number of folk who have more faith in white allyship than black solidarity, and y'all see where that got us, right? The thing is, Hoteps aren't stupid. It's just a lot of them believe some really stupid stuff. And again, whose fault is that? And again, y'all made that excuse for white folks, and you see where that got us, right? And y'all might say it's not your job to educate them on what's a simple Google search away. But again, for how long have we wasted energy on supposedly well-meaning whites before finally throwing the towel in on them? And I still see some of y'all, even after what has transpired over the past Jesus Christ. I'm not even going to say, yeah, over the past month, still wringing your hands over how to pull your suburban white male coworkers far enough left to cast a vote for anyone besides a white man with dementia for once. And I'm not going to lie, it's excruciatingly frustrating when you got a kufi wearing cousin sitting right freaking there who already got the puzzle pieces in front of him. He just don't know how to put it together. Or at the very least, just get out of the way of the folk who will engage that population, and y'all can go messing with the white folks on your own time. As Fanon argues, the black bourgeoisie assimilated the culture of the colonizer, and as a result have learned disdain for schools of black thought that do not originate from traditional methods of education, but more importantly for the people who adhere to those schools of thought, i.e. poor and working class people. Like I said earlier, when Black Power died, there was no one left to proselytize that ideology to the hood except the bow tie and bean pie brigade. None of you middle class born divine nine niggas thought enough of us to teach us better. And that's the handful of y'all who weren't too busy trying and failing to rebuild Black Wall Street through online storefronts and Hennessy glazed salmon plates. I wonder how well that's turning out in this economy. At EOD, the reality is Hoteptry, if anything, is an indictment against those who despise it most. It's a reminder that solidarity among many black Americans really does only go skin deep. That black power isn't nearly as strong as the power of the dollar. And I'm not saying that that can't change. If I didn't think it could, I wouldn't even bother to have made this video. But what I am saying is that in order for something to change, we got to stop acting like it hasn't been what it has been for the longest time.
There is a reason why there was skepticism, but that same reason for skepticism exists, like you just pointed out, in every other major school of alternative thought. It's just that for black people, there was this so much effort put into making it seem like the sketchy parts were all that there was to it.
Yeah.
So the left in general has had a 60-year campaign against it to distort what the left is, what it believes, etc. But white leftists and white leftist thought, alternative thought, had the benefit of white scholarship, white academia, and white online leftists to clear stuff out the way, maybe a little too much, so that you could catch the falsehoods there. Conversely, it's low-key up to us to do that for
right. Yeah.
That's kind of what I see these videos as. Before, it was more like, I don't feel like putting this out there just because it's black folks' business. Right. I know a white audience. I don't feel like having to answer this question 55 times in the comment section. Because every time I say the word Hotep, somebody's gonna ask, what's a Hotep in the comment section?
Yeah.
And
I just ignore it.
I just ignore it too.
Yeah.
It's like, all right, now that the platform is here, it may be useful to explain this, if not just to explain it to other Negroes that was in my position, so that they can have a better perception of where this knowledge is.
I'll wrap this up by referring back to Fanon. Based on his criticism, it can be argued that Hoteps and black intellectuals are mirrors of the same white mask. Whereas the Hotep, specifically that line of Hoteptry, directly inspired by the NOI and by extension Moorish science, is an appropriation of white conservatism, with the racial dichotomy just being flipped upside down. Black liberals and leftists, for that matter, specifically the middle and upper class ones, are mirrors of white leftists. In the same way that white leftism historically has failed to consider, let alone engage, the racial component of systemic oppression, blacks on the same end of the political spectrum fail to engage class, specifically the class of the people who are most oppressed. The reason being, like I said before, most so-called leftists aren't really leftists so much as they see leftism as a means to attain the privilege their marginalization has denied them. For many white feminists, it's access to patriarchy. For many white queers, it's the privilege of heteroness. Same goes for black folks. A lot of people don't want wholesale black liberation. They are just sick of their access to the American dream being limited by the color of their skin. And okay, that's not an inherently bad thing, but it's really disingenuous to make black and proud the foundation of your politics when it's only a certain kind of blackness you bother to be bothered with to begin with. Again, to each his own, but don't pop off online about how unserious your white leftist homies are when you can't even ride through the hood with your car doors unlocked and your windows rolled down. I'll take my speakers offering now, if you don't mind, because I was preaching in this bitch.
I'm black, y'all, and I'm black, y'all, and I'm blacker than black, and I'm black, y'all, and I'm black, y'all, and I'm black, y'all, and I'm blacker than black, and I'm black, y'all. I'm blinking.